if you haven't been tuning into our midweek lessons, tonight would be an interesting night to get started. It's going to be an interesting one in that we're going to breach a subject that has just the right tinge of controversy to, give it a bit of an edge and make it interesting. Jesus is talking about false teachers from Matthew 7, near the tail end of the Sermon on the Mount, so that's going to be fun, and I hope to see you guys join us there. But otherwise, if you are ready to roll, grab your Bible, get comfortable, and let's dial in. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in here because there's a lot to discuss. We're actually looking at 2 chapters of 1 Samuel today, 1 Samuel 27 and 1 Samuel 28. 1 Samuel 27 is only 12 verses, and 1 Samuel 28 isn't much longer, so we've kind of mashed them together. But 1 Samuel 28 contains the story of Saul and the witch of Endor. So that one's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to getting to that here in a second. But before we do, we're going to open up to Psalm 70, which is itself very brief, only 5 verses. Psalm 70. As you turn there, I think a good question to ask before we open this up is to take a moment as we consider our own lives and ask ourselves, what do we rely on moment by moment when adversity comes? We've had a lot of time to think about that question, I think, over the last 2 months. And I bring it up again now when it's been brought up over and over and over again because over the last 2 months, I think we've learned a lot about how much we actually desire true communion with God. That lifelong deep dependence on Him, that leaning on Him, counting on Him in an intimate, personal way, not just sort of as like a mystical force out here that we kind of like knock on wood to or whatever other superstitious nonsense you want to think of. But what's interesting to me about the psalm that we're about to read is that in just 5 verses, David lays out for us the way you get there. That is to say, the way that you begin to live into communion with God, dependence on Him. In verse 5, you're going to hear him call himself poor and needy. And that harkens back to the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 7, doesn't it? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Right? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Let's hear what David has to say. Make haste, O God, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let them be put to shame and confusion who seek my life. Let them be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my hurt. Let them turn back because of their shame who say, Aha! That is to say, who sort of have figured out the way to get to him, who have figured out the way to hurt him. That's what that exclamation means. Verse 4. May all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say evermore, God is great. But I am poor and needy. Hasten to me, O God. You are my help and my deliverer, O Lord. Do not delay. My takeaway from just those brief 5 verses is that the degree to which I feel myself, know myself to be spiritually weak and personally inadequate, to the degree that I know those things, that's the degree to which I will call out for God's help. That's the degree to which I will seek God to fill my lack. And I think the part of the point of this psalm is that that's a prayer that God delights to answer. Let's pray and we'll jump into 1 Samuel. Jesus, as we approach this holy book, we do have to acknowledge our inadequacy for the task. We're coming with a myriad of distractions right at the peak of the week. All kinds of things rattling around in our heads. School coming to a close and the possibility of the country beginning to open back up and all sorts of personal worries and strife and struggle that has carried on over the last few weeks coming to a head now. So yes, we need your help. We are inadequate. But we know that this isn't causing you to look down your nose at us. If anything, this is an opportunity for you to show your love for us and to show your glory by providing what we don't have, by making up for what we need. We ask now for just the simple grace of being able to see you in your word, to see your glory, to enjoy you, and to feel the truth of the fact that you enjoy us. We love you. Help us now to see your beauty, And it's in Jesus' name that we ask this. Amen. All right, so let's dive right on in here, because this is funky. We got some weird crap going on here. So at the end of 1 Samuel 26, David and Saul have had another little face-to-face, and David spares Saul's life again. You know, the incident with the spear and the water jug and all that stuff. And so they separate. And 1 Samuel 27 picks things up right from there. Verse 1. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines." What? That's a big reversal. Did he not just say, "May the Lord judge between us"? Right? Verse 17 through 20 of chapter 26. Did he not just tell Saul, "I'm trusting my life into the Lord's hands"? And now he's all like, can't decide, like whether or not he trusts God to do it, and so he's going to go to the Philistines to protect him. This is strange. I don't know how you feel about this. I mean, if you've got thoughts, feel free to throw them here in the comments. But do you suppose, is David just being wise here? Right? Is he just doing the math and going, okay, this is a smart decision to make, or does this demonstrate some kind of lack of trust in God? I mean, I'll tell you what I think. I think David is experiencing a kind of wavering of faith here. I think the pressure is on him enormously. I mean, if you think about it, David's been able to evade Saul pretty cleanly for a couple of years, but now 3 times in what is probably about a 6-month period, 3 times Saul has gotten close enough to kill him. And so I think the added pressure is testing David's trust. And now you sort of say 3 strikes, you're out. David's going, okay, I've gotten my 3. I need to do something to protect myself. So he makes the decision to move out of Israelite territory into Philistine territory. And look at what happens. So the middle of verse 1. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. So David arose and went over, that is, over the border, he and the 600 men who were with him, to, who do you think? Achish, the son of Maach, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Okay, so we got to hit pause here. Do you remember Achish? We ran into him several chapters ago when David was initially fleeing from Saul years ago, back in chapter 21. David goes to Achish. Right? He's had this idea before, in other words. And when he gets there, Achish and his men recognize David as the fellow who had killed Goliath of Gath not all that long ago. David has to pretend to be crazy to get out of their hands. So what changes here? It's difficult to say, but here's what we do know. Basically, David shows up with 600 guys, and at the same time, Saul and the Philistines have been clashing for years at this point, pretty much nonstop. So it's pretty safe to say that Saul has become, as the Bible would put it, a stench in Achish's nostrils. So it's likely that Achish goes, okay, because he would have heard at this point that David and Saul are also at odds, and it makes a ton of sense for Achish to say, okay, so this guy's got a claim on the Israelite throne, and he wants to come and be loyal to me. Okay, I can handle that. He's only got 600 dudes. The Philistines have tens of thousands of, so he's not a threat. So we can use him. Yeah, we can use him. We can use him as a propaganda tool against Israel. We can use him as a tool against Saul. That's what Achish is thinking. And so however much personal animosity he's got for David, however much harm David did to the Philistines in times past, you know what they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Achish seems to lean into this. Now, that's from a worldly perspective. That worldly logic works for Achish. But for David, this is tough. This is a tough one to jive. I think this is a failure on his part. And I've got reasons to think that'll come out later in the book, not in this particular passage, but later in the book. I think we'll see some reasons why. But look at what happens, verse 5. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" That is to say, David is acknowledging to Achish that they are of different races. David's a Jew, Achish is a Gentile, and they both would have been uncomfortable with that arrangement for various reasons. So David's trying to politely put a little distance between them. Verse 6, so that day Achish gave him Ziklag. It's a city. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land, and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. And when Achish asked, where have you made a raid today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negev of the Kenites. So David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, so has David done. Such was his custom all while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, he has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel, therefore he shall always be my servant. Okay, so to clarify, here's what's going on. David comes to Achish, and the bargain basically looks like this. Achish says, okay, you can stay with us. We'll keep you away from Saul, but you have to raid Israelite territory for us, the way that the Philistines have been doing all along, right? You've got to participate in these. Now, obviously, David can't do that, right? He can't attack his own people. He doesn't have actual loyalty to Achish. He's using Achish as a shield against Saul. So David, again, operating on worldly logic here, he instead attacks the territories of those who live south of Philistia instead of Israelite territory. So he goes and he attacks other Gentile countries and other Gentile territories, the Amalekites, the Geshurites, the Girzites, going as far south as Egypt, right, to make raids and bring back stuff to prove that he did something. And then he claims that he went over into the territory of Judah, you see. So Achish is fooled by this, and David is able to kind of walk that balancing act, right, between loyalty to Achish and loyalty to Israel, and keep himself safe from Saul at the same time. So that's the situation that we leave David in. He's in Ziklag for 1 year and 6 months. But now we turn back to Saul, 1 Samuel chapter 28. Get a load of this. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel, and Achish said to David, understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army. David said to Achish, very well, you shall know what your servant can do. And Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. You recall, we learned that in 1 Samuel 25. The author is reminding us now. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. So that one clarification, because we're not super familiar with what a medium is or what a necromancer is. So, in the Old Testament law, one thing that was explicitly banned was any kind of divination or fortune-telling or the use of demonic powers, all sorts of things, or alternately just straight-up chicanery as ways of doing magic. And the problem wasn't even so much the magic as it was the point of the magic. All along the way, one of the activity to kind of do their magic, right? To clarify here, we're not talking Harry Potter, right? We're talking like actual, honest to goodness, like babies' throats being cut, like horrible, horrible stuff here, right? So during the time of the judges, before Saul was king, Israel just did not really pay much attention to the law of God, especially when it came to this kind of thing. So mediums and necromancers are named here. Mediums were those who could claim to look into the future in one way or another. They'd kill a chicken and they'd, like, this is actual stuff. They would kill a chicken and then throw its intestines on the ground, and then supposedly they could tell you the future from the shape that the intestines made, right? This isn't like palm reading. This isn't, a psychic hotline. This is darker stuff. This is heavier stuff. Necromancers were those who claimed to be able to raise the dead and speak to them, right? And to clarify here, when we say raise the dead and speak to them, we mean literally call their bodies up out of the ground and talk to them. Or alternately call their spirit up out of the ground and talk to them. That's what necromancers could supposedly do. And we've got, and just like today, there were both frauds, people who, and there were probably more frauds than the real deal. Tons of frauds out there. who, with the application of the right drugs and a little bit of sleight of hand and that kind of thing, could make you think you were seeing or hearing all sorts of things. And then there were those who genuinely seemed to have some kind of contact with some kind of demonic force that will allow them to imitate the dead. We get examples of that both in the Old and the New Testaments. But the point is that Saul has stepped up at some point in the past and outlawed those practices and put them out of Israel. So what happens next is alarming. Verse 4. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. Now, we don't know how the war between Israel and the Philistines has progressed so far, but it's worth saying that the fact that the Philistines are able to get this close to Gilboa as Shunem, that is to say they're just a few miles apart from one another, that's alarming, because Gilboa is where Saul's seat of power is at. So it seems that the Israelites have been getting pushed back over time. Right. Saul is this is the last place he can run to. This is his last strong place. So he's deeply concerned. This is why he's afraid in verse 5. We're told his heart trembled greatly. Verse 6. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, Behold, there is a medium at Endor. Not the forest moon from Star Wars, like Endor, the place in Judah. There are no Ewoks. Just so we're clear. Anyway, verse 8 rather. So Saul disguised himself, and to put on other garments, and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, Divine for me a spirit, and to bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? So she thinks he's a narc, right? She thinks like, you want, I see what's going on here. The minute I start, you're going to cut my throat. But, verse 10, Saul swore to her by the Lord, As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Is he out of his mind? Do you see how crazy that is? Whose law is it that says that mediums and necromancers are to be removed from the land and their practices are to be outlawed? God's. Okay. So Saul's the king of what nation? God's. And Saul swears an oath to this woman that he won't punish her under God's law by whose name? God's. This doesn't make a lick of sense. Saul has completely cracked at this point. But here's what's concerning about this to me. What worries me about this is actually how common this kind of misunderstanding of God is. Saul treats God like he's kind of a talisman. Have you noticed that? Like he's a good luck charm. Every time Saul just really wants people to know he's being sincere, every time Saul just really wants to kind of like put a stamp on something or just get his way or like kind of manipulate somebody, he brings God into it, right? And again, we've talked about this idea before. Saul doesn't think he's the bad guy. Right? No one thinks they're the bad guy. Saul believes himself to be genuine, right? He believes himself to be a worshiper of Yahweh who's just kind of, gotten afoul of things and things have gone a little sideways, but they can still work it out, right? But he's so far off that he's applying God's name, right, to necromancy now, to the practice of calling up the dead. Now, before you think, wow, I would never do that. But the thing is, as Christians, we do this all the time. We absolutely expect God to kind of put his thumbprint on our unholy, idolatrous, evil practices. Right? One thing that I remember as an example of this in history, and I remember this because it's so stark to me, is that during the American-Spanish War, we invaded the Philippines, and there's a long story behind that. This was back in the 1800s. And there was we committed a horrible war crime in the process, slaughtered several thousand Filipino civilians. Basically, there was a large hole in the ground, a large crater after a battle, and these men and women and children were taking refuge in it. And under orders from I can't remember if it was the equivalent of the Joint Chiefs at the time or what. They killed several thousand Filipino citizens really for no reason other than the shock and awe of it, kind of as an act of terrorism. And in the American newspapers, God's name was applied to this as though it was some kind of great battle and victory that we'd won, you know. There were prayers of thanksgiving that were offered over this event in Philadelphia, in Boston, in St. Louis. Really grim, gruesome way of using God's name. But I bring that up not to, sort of get political or anything like that, but just to say that, like, Christians, we do this. Right? We do the exact same thing that Saul's doing here. So notice how this plays out for him. Verse 11. The woman seems to be reassured by Saul's promise. He says this, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, "Bring up Samuel for me." Now, we don't know what happens between verse 11 and verse 12, but evidently something real freaky happens, because we say, then we're told, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." Reading between the lines, well, actually not really reading between the lines, here's the implication. This woman's a fake. She's never actually brought anyone from the dead before. And so she does her little, ritual, does her little magic, and then Samuel's spirit suddenly shows up, and it's like, oh crap, this worked. She's obviously a smart lady, though, because she connects the dots. Who would Samuel show up for, right? Who would he actually, come up from death out of for? Probably Saul. It's a guess, and she's right. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a god coming up out of the earth." I mean, she's terrified. Absolutely terrified. The word here is literally spirit. I see a spirit coming up out of the earth. We translate this as God because it's the same term that was used for pagan deities like Dagon, right? A spirit. She sees a spirit coming up out of the ground. Verse 14, he said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he's wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. This is dark. This is dark stuff. Verse 15, then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me." That is to say, dead. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hands of the Philistines. Whew. So, there's one question that everyone always asks when this text comes up. First, is this actually Samuel? And I think that's a fair question. Commentators don't agree on this. Is this actually Samuel, or is this some kind of evil spirit? And they would point back at verse 13, where the woman describes this figure coming up out of the ground as a god, right? As they would say, oh, it's some kind of demon who's sent to trick Saul and to freak him out or whatever. But here's the problem. This prophecy that Samuel speaks here, or this Samuel-like figure speaks in verse 16 through 19, comes true. In other words, it's a true prophecy, and therefore spoken by a true prophet. Does that make sense? Here's what I think's going on. Saul's been trying to inquire of the Lord by all these different means, by dreams, by Urim and Thummim, by prophets, on and on and on. And in his desperation, frankly, in his wickedness, in his unwillingness to submit to God and to simply repent, right? Because that would be the easiest thing to do at this point, right? Would be to say, okay, Lord, I'm in a horrible situation here. I need to turn away from what I've been doing and accept whatever it is that you have for me here, and just to try to obey your will from this point forward, whatever it is, even if that means that I go and I fight and I die. No. Saul's got to find a way out of this. So he goes to this witch, this medium, this spiritist, this necromancer, whatever term you want to use. And it's almost as though God goes, okay, fine. You really want to hear from me? Great, let's do it. Now, So Samuel's spirit comes from the place of the dead, I think, to genuinely speak to Saul, not because of the magic that this woman does, but because of the power of God. Right? God allows this bizarre, once ever event to happen. Because to clarify here, this isn't a thing that happens. Scripture is abundantly clear elsewhere that once you are dead and your spirit is dead, you are dead. There's no such thing as ghosts. People don't come back from the afterlife to talk to you. Your dead loved ones don't sort of become angels, don't become your guardian angels, like all this pop culture stuff that gets repeated. Those are comforting ideas sometimes to certain folks, but there certainly aren't biblical ones. The point is that this event this is the only time anything even remotely like this happens in Scripture. And so it ought to stand out to us. It ought to stand out to us as bizarre and weird and evil, and it ought to make our skin crawl. And part of the reason that it ought to make our skin crawl is not just because of how uncanny and strange it all is, but because of Saul's attitude about the whole thing. Saul's attitude is though he can kind of manipulate everyone around him to get what he needs and make happen what he wants to happen. He's so bent on his prosperity, his military success, his position, that in spite of all of the battering he's taken up to this point, he can't let it go and submit to God. And he's willing to go this far, right, to try to get his way. Verse 20. Then Saul fell at once, full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, Behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand, and have listened to what you have said to me. Now therefore you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you, and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it, and she took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread of it, and she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. That meal, that's a death meal. That's your death row inmate's final request right there. This is heavy stuff, and with reason. So, what's going on here? What are we supposed to get out of this? I've talked a lot about application and that sort of thing already, but I hope you find this whole thing unsettling. I sure do. This is a strange, creepy story on its own, but when you look at Saul and you look at just how neck deep he's gotten in his own way, and look at how blindly convinced he is that he can still somehow get out of his trouble, get out from under his sin. And even worse than that, the fact that he's somehow still convinced that he's got God on his side is deeply, deeply concerning, because Saul is not an idiot. That's the thing. He's a smart guy. We've seen all along the way through 1 Samuel that he's a gifted tactician and thinker and leader when he wants to be. Right? He's not a fool. He works hard. He's not a lazy dude by any stretch of the imagination. He's got all the right tools. He's got all the right gifts even. Right? God gifted him a measure of the Holy Spirit at the beginning of his kingship, if you recall. And this is where he winds up. If that's true of Saul, then the question has to be asked, is it true of us? Or is it true of us at times? So, for my own reflection, I have to ask myself, are there ways in which I am asking God or expecting God to just kind of be okay with or overlook or even think that he is approving of my worldly ways of thinking, my worldly systems of value that I've absorbed and adopted for myself? And that's a cause for some thought. Your mileage may vary, but that's worth dwelling on. Because as people of God, and as people who claim to love God, part of that means loving his ways, right? And if you discover that you have been harming someone that you love by cutting against what is important to them or what they value, you change, right? We do this for our spouses, for those of you adults who are watching who are married. But students, you do this for your friends, you do this for your parents, you do this for your siblings, right? Those that you care about. You are willing to adjust the trajectory of your life. You're willing to adjust your values, the way you speak, and so on, in healthy ways, not boundaryless ways. We could talk about codependence and that kind of thing, but that's not really what's in view here. In order to better love the people we care about, right? The same is true for God. The same ought to be true of our relationship with God. The difference here, of course, is that he defines what is good. He defines what is right and wrong. So it's not just a matter of relationship, it's also a matter of righteousness. But we have to constantly be considering our own ways. As David says in one of the Psalms, search me, God. Search me for any crooked ways in me. Right? Saul's gotten real crooked here. And the final word that he hears from Samuel is the news that today's the day you die. So everything that happens from 1 Samuel from this point forward happens over the course of just a few days. So tomorrow we're going to look at 1 Samuel 29 and 30. And then Thursday we'll look at and then Friday rather, we'll look at 1 Samuel 31, and that'll close out the book. But all of these events happen over the course of about 3 or 4 days. And we will have come to the end of 1 Samuel. So we'll have to talk about what to do next week, whether or not we'll just roll into 2 Samuel and go from there. If you've got any opinions on that, drop it in the comments. We could totally do 2 Samuel, or maybe we jump to a different Old Testament book, or we take a look at something in the New Testament, given that we've probably only got a week or two left in quarantine or what have you. And we'll see what the future of these daily devotions are past that point. Put some thought into that. If you've got any opinions, let me know. Otherwise, make sure to join us for midweek tonight at 7 p.m. via the exact same channels that you're watching this on. That's 7 p.m., and I'm looking forward to that. That'll be a good time. Otherwise, if you need anything, as always, don't hesitate to reach out. You are loved. Jesus cares for you. His church cares for you. And don't forget the good news of the gospel for yourself today. Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. And because all those things are true, you can go in peace. So, Facebook, YouTube, I'll see you later.